questions is one of the best ways to teach an adult. It's what I do for a living, by the way. I write supplements to Lifeway Sunday School materials. You can look at those on my webpage if you'd like to. They're based on a question and answer format. They're called Good Questions, Have Groups Talking. And it arranges the talk today around a series of questions. And the first one goes like this. Next slide. What do you think about when you have nothing else to think about? Where does your mind kind of naturally drift? Some of you had a drive here and you've got to drive home. And when you're driving, and I'll be driving to Jacksonville this afternoon to catch a plane out tonight, where does your mind kind of naturally drift? And it's an important question because the Bible says, next slide, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And what you think about in those idle moments, when you got some time off or you're waiting for someone or someone is late to meet you for lunch or whatever, where your mind kind of naturally drifts, the Bible says that is who you are. Now, the next question I want to ask you is a little bit problematic theologically, but I'm heading somewhere with this, so just bear with me. What do you think God thinks about when God has nothing else to think about? Where does God's mind kind of naturally drift if God had a day off? Now, the question is problematic on several levels, and among other things, we know that God is omniscient. Everybody say omniscient? All right, what does that mean? He's really smart, right? It's a little more to it than really smart, but it means God can think about everything all the time. He knows everything, and he can think about everything, and God can think every thought that every human who will ever live, and he can think about all of it simultaneously. And but we get some insight into this question when Jesus told us not one, not two, but three back-to-back parables. Now, who's the greatest teacher who ever lived? Let's try that again. You got it right, but with a little more gusto this time. Ready? Who's the greatest teacher who ever lived? Jesus. All right. If you get asked that kind of question in church sometime you're not sure, just take a guess. It might be Jesus. Reminds me of a cute little Sunday school story I heard one time of a teacher of 4-year-olds, and he says to those 4-year-old boys, "What's brown and furry and lives up in the trees and collects up acorns in the summer to eat in the winter?" Boy thought for a minute and thought, "I know the answer must be Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me." Well, the answer to the question, who is the greatest teacher who ever lived, is Jesus, all right? And I'm working on a new book on how Jesus taught. And one of the things that Jesus did when he taught by repetition. Because Jesus knew that a lot of times our problem is not always a dedication problem, it's a retention problem. And if you want to teach well, you ought to teach using creative repetition, as Jesus does here. And he's really kind of trying to make one point, but he tells us 3 different stories that all are kind of making the same point. So let's look at the first story. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep. Now, just by the way, any of you got 100 sheep? Anybody? I got one here. Somebody here got 100 sheep?
My daughter does.
Daughter has 100 sheep. Or I run into someone occasionally. But I think you will agree with me that in our world, it's fairly rare for someone to have 100 sheep. You agree with that? Do you think it was rare in Jesus' day? All right, so here is the first lesson we learned. I don't know if you ever thought about this, but a lot of preaching and teaching sounds a little bit old-fashioned. Have you ever noticed that? We tell lots of stories off the farm. And a lot of our stories have a kind of musty feel to them because we think they're old and they sound spiritual. All right? And I think if Jesus were telling this story today, back then, I think he was actually standing in front of people who had sheep. And so that's why he said, suppose one of you has 100 sheep. And I think everybody there sit there and go, that makes sense to me. But we tell the story today and we think, well, who in the world has 100 sheep? So one question you want to ask yourself as you teach is, how would Jesus tell this story if he were teaching 4-year-olds? Or how would he tell this story if he were living today? What is something that we might have 100 of and might lose one? Somebody said, well, came to my mind, and that was $100. All right, you may or may not have $100 of cash on you. But I think most of us, if it were important to us for one reason or another, we could get a hold of $100. And suppose you had $100, you kept it in a money clip in your purse or your pocket, and one day you counted through those $100, and you noticed there was only $99. Jesus is trying to get you in touch with that feeling. What would that feeling be? Well, in my mind, if I had $100 and I counted through and I could only come up with 99, I would double check my work for starters. And then, what's the next thing you would do? The next thing I would do is I would be calling a kid in here. Just because I'm a little bit suspicious and a little bit jaded. But that's probably the first thing I'd do. But then the next thing I would do is reevaluate the whole money clip idea. And do I really need to be carrying $100 around? And is this really smart? And, you know, if I lost $100 every day for a while, how much would I lose? And it would be kind of a wake-up call. Like, is this a good idea? But then at the end of the day, I would also think, I had $100. Now I got $99. Are you real worried about this? You're just like, oh my gosh, go nuts, go crazy. Where can I find that dollar? No, you would not. All right, it would be a little bit of a wake-up call, maybe reevaluate the money clip idea, but then I would kind of breathe and say, well, just 1 out of 100. Okay? So it would not be that big a deal. What I want you to notice in this story, and in all these stories, is that is not the reaction of the guy who lost 100 sheep. He kind of goes nuts. Because what Jesus is telling us here, in not 1, not 2, but 3 back-to-back parables is, when you lose something, you kind of go crazy, and you kind of lose your mind, and you get real focused, as this guy does here. All right, so suppose one of you has 100 sheep, and he loses one. Does he not leave the 99? Leave the 99. He ought to be doubly focused on paying attention to the 99. He ought to have had a wake-up call to remind him that he needs to stay with the 99. But what does he do? He leaves. All right, now, if he's going to leave, surely he wouldn't be gone very long, right? How long was the shepherd gone? How long? I'm a small group leader at heart here. I like to ask questions. Let me just get out here how Dr. Towns was. How long was he gone? Well, what if it took a long time? What if he had other stuff to do? None of that matters, because when you lose something, you kind of go nuts. And I think one of the reasons why we miss this is because a lot of the words that are used in the Bible have become for us theological words. But when Jesus used these words, they were not theological words. In other words, when I stand in church and I talk about the lost sheep, are you thinking about actual sheep that got lost? Are you thinking about a theological category of losses? And when you teach, I would invite you to ask yourself the question, what did this word mean before Baptists got a hold of it? Before this word became something in a theological dictionary, what did this word mean? And I want you to think about what this word lost means and how we use it in kind of normal life. Several years ago, I was vacationing on the West Coast and went to Universal Studios. And after the end of the day, we stopped by one of the little gift shops there, pulled out my wallet to pay for some gifts at Universal Studios, and bought the gifts. I thought that I put that card back in my wallet. Turns out I did not. So the card doesn't go back in there. The wallet goes back in my pocket. I drive across town, get a bite to eat, and I pull out my wallet to pay for supper, and I noticed that credit card that I'd used to pay for the gifts at Universal Studios is not there. And it's not like I'm worried, like, how in the world am I going to pay for supper? How am I going to get home on vacation? I'm not thinking about that because I got a whole bunch of cards. In fact, some of you are going to recommend I see Dave Ramsey because I got quite a few other cards, and I'm trying to buy a house out in California on my credit cards if we needed to. But anyway, I'm not too worried about how I'm going to pay for supper or how I'm going to get home, whatever. But I'm real focused in on what in the world that credit card, where in the world that credit card is. And had you been joining us for supper that night, and you're observant, you would have noticed something happening right before your eyes. And that is, I started supper with the kind of vacation day, what we call out in New Mexico, where I live, a mañana attitude. Do y'all know what the word mañana means? All right, now here's a little tip for teacher, by the way. When you do word studies, you ought to look up what a word means in a dictionary. Find a Greek or Hebrew dictionary if you can work out how to get there. But look it up in a dictionary. But then one of the most important things you can do beyond that is ask yourself, how was this word used in normal life? The word we looked at last night, practice hospitality. That word practice, 3/4 of the time that it's translated persecute. Did I talk about this last night? All right. It has to do when Paul said, I press on toward the mark. That's the word that's used there. It has to do with chasing down something. It's a very strong, aggressive kind of word. It had to do with an animal that's chasing down its prey, and came to be used in a secondary sense about like Paul chasing down those Christians to persecute them. And when Paul says practice hospitality, it's not kind of a light and fluffy word. And you get a feel for how that word is used, not only just by the dictionary definition, but how it's used in common life. The word manana is not, of course, a biblical word, but it illustrates this point. Because if you look it up in the dictionary, you find that, in fact, it means what you said, tomorrow. But if you live where I live, in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and you listen to the way people use the word mañana, you will soon find out it does not mean tomorrow at all. It means later. It means when I get around to it. It means whenever I feel like it. In other words, if I had a repairman come to my house and look at my dishwasher and it's broken, and he said, I'm going to have to get a part. And I said, when will you be back? And he says, I'll be back mañana. You think he's coming back tomorrow? He's not. It's a state of mind, all right? And so I began supper with this mañana state of mind. And as I looked through my billfold and checked all these cards, and maybe, one card is stuck to another one and whatever, my mañana attitude was quickly turning into a kind of agitated, focused intensity. And if you've been joining us for supper that night, you might, reach across the table and say, Josh, we can take care of supper, and they got all kinds of safeguards in place, and this is going to be fine. And you'd have heard me say something like that. It ain't fine, because it's my credit card, and it's lost, and I don't know where it is, and we're going to call the credit card company, and we're going to have them look up the account, and we're going to see if any abuse has taken place.